The nausea hit her at 6:47 in the morning, right in the middle of brushing her teeth. Petra gripped the edge of the sink and waited for it to pass, the way she had every morning for the past 3 weeks. She looked at herself in the mirror, the slight puffiness around her eyes, the color in her cheeks that wasn't quite right, and she almost smiled. Almost, because smiling felt too big a thing to do alone in a bathroom at 6:47 in the morning, when the person who was supposed to be sharing this with her was still asleep down the hall. She pressed one hand flat against her stomach, still nothing to feel. Just a quiet, impossible fact living inside her. The pregnancy test was still in the drawer. She'd taken it 4 days ago and then taken 2 more because she didn't trust the first one, didn't trust herself to read it right, didn't trust her own hands that kept shaking. 3 tests, 3 identical results. She'd lined them up on the counter and stared at them for so long that the bathroom light started to feel too bright. She should have woken Wesley up that night. She knew that. But something made her fold the tests into a paper towel and tuck them in her purse and carry the news alone for 4 days, turning it over in her mind like a stone she wasn't ready to set down. Petra was 31 years old. She was a licensed occupational therapist at a rehabilitation center in Charlotte, North Carolina. And she was the kind of person who kept a planner and paid her bills early and called her mother every Sunday. She had built her life carefully, piece by piece, the way you build something you intend to last. She had met Wesley 4 years ago at a conference in Atlanta. He was a physician's assistant, broad-shouldered, quick to laugh, with a habit of putting his hand on the small of her back when they walked through crowded rooms. She had loved that about him, the way he always seemed to know where she was. They had been together for 4 years and married for 2. They had a house in a neighborhood with mature trees and a front porch they kept meaning to get furniture for. They had a dog named Scout, who slept between them every night and stole socks from the laundry basket. They had plans, the kind of plans you make when you believe in the future of something. She rinsed her face, dried it, and stood in the hallway for a moment before going back to the bedroom. Wesley was awake. He was sitting on the edge of the bed with his back to her, his phone in his hand, and when she said his name, he turned around with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between surprise and something else. "Morning," he said. "Morning." She sat down beside him. "I need to tell you something." She watched his face carefully as she said it, watched the way his eyes stilled, the small silence before he spoke. "Petra." He said her name like it was a whole sentence, like it was an answer to something. "I know we talked about maybe in another year or 2, Petra." He reached over and took her hand, his palm was warm. "This is good news," she exhaled. He pulled her in and held her for a long time, and she let herself believe it. The doctor's appointment was scheduled for a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks later. Petra had been counting down to it, the way she used to count down to Christmas as a child. Not because anything was wrong, but because she needed something to make it feel real. An ultrasound. A heartbeat. A date on a paper that said, "Yes, this is happening, this is true." Wesley had promised to meet her there. He'd written it in his own planner, which meant something, because Wesley didn't write things down unless he intended to do them. She had teased him about it. "Don't lose that planner," she'd said, and he'd laughed. She took the afternoon off work. She drove to the OB's office, which was in a medical complex on the east side, and she sat in the waiting room with a paper cup of water and a magazine she didn't read. Her appointment was at 2:30. At 2:25 she texted Wesley. "Almost time. Where are you?" She watched the little dots appear and disappear, running a few minutes late. "Start without me if they call you. I'll be there." She put the phone face down in her lap. They called her at 2:35. The ultrasound tech was young and kind, and had a small tattoo of a sunflower on her wrist. She asked Petra if her husband was joining her, and Petra said yes, he was on his way, he would probably be here by the time. The screen lit up, and everything else in the world got very quiet. The tech pointed at a small shape, a flicker so fast Petra almost missed it, and said, "There's the heartbeat." Petra cried. She hadn't expected to. Not like that, not alone in a dim room with a stranger while her husband was somewhere in traffic, but she cried the way you cry when something enormous and true lands on you all at once. The tech handed her tissues and didn't say anything, just waited, and Petra was grateful for that. She was still in the parking lot, the printed ultrasound image in her hand, when she finally called him. It rang 4 times before going to voicemail. She sat in the car for a moment. Then she texted, "I have a picture. It's real. Where are you?" No answer for 11 minutes. Then, "Sorry, got pulled into something. Heading home now." She stared at the message. She drove home. She didn't confront him that night. She told herself it was because she was tired, and that was partly true. But the other part was that She kept looking at the ultrasound photo on the kitchen counter, and she didn't want whatever was building in the back of her throat to happen in the same room as it. She was also, though she wouldn't have said this out loud yet, paying attention. The way he refilled her water glass without being asked, he'd always done that. The way he kept his phone screen tilted slightly away from her at dinner, he didn't always do that. The way he talked about the baby in terms that felt a little rehearsed, like someone delivering lines they'd prepared on the drive home. She told herself she was imagining things. Pregnant women are anxious, she knew this. She'd worked with enough of them to know how the hormones could sharpen every small thing into something that felt like evidence. She told herself that for about 2 weeks. The event that ended that particular lie happened on a Thursday evening in October. Wesley's coworker was being promoted, and the hospital was hosting a small gathering at a rooftop venue downtown. Petra had planned to go. She'd even bought something new to wear, a dark green dress that still fit, barely. But that afternoon, one of her patients, an older man recovering from a stroke who had been making genuine, hard-won progress, had a setback, and she stayed late to help recalibrate his treatment plan. By the time she left the office, it was after 7, and she had a headache behind her left eye that felt like a warning. She texted Wesley that she wasn't coming. He texted back a thumbs-up emoji. Just a thumbs up. She sat with that for a second in the parking garage. Then she drove downtown. She told herself she just wanted to see him, wanted to slip in, find him in the crowd, let him put his hand on the small of her back the way he used to. She didn't have a reason beyond that. She wasn't looking for anything. The venue was on the 14th floor of a building on Trade Street, and the elevator opened right into it. Music, voices, the clink of glasses. Petra stepped in holding her little evening bag and looked around. She saw him in under a minute. He was standing near the bar, and he was not alone. The woman beside him was tall, with close-cropped natural hair and a red dress, and she was visibly, unmistakably pregnant, further along than Petra, 6 or 7 months at least. Wesley had his hand on the woman's lower back, the same way he used to hold Petra, and he was leaning down to say something in her ear, and the woman was laughing. Petra didn't move. She stood at the edge of the room for what felt like a very long time. Long enough to see him refill the woman's water glass. Long enough to see him rest his palm, briefly, against the woman's belly. Long enough to feel the ultrasound photo in her memory like something she was holding in both hands. A server appeared at her elbow. "Can I get you something?" "No," Petra said. "I'm leaving." She took the elevator back down to the lobby. She walked to her car. She sat down in the driver's seat and put both hands on the steering wheel and stared at the concrete pillar in front of her. Then she put the car in reverse and drove home and put Wesley's dinner plate in the microwave and went upstairs and sat on the bathroom floor, which was cold through her dress and didn't move for a very long time. She didn't tell anyone right away. Not her mother, who would have driven up from Columbia immediately and not been able to help saying, "I told you something was off about him." Not her friend Zoe, who loved her fiercely but couldn't keep a secret past the third glass of wine. Not her sister-in-law, who was Wesley's sister first. She told no one, and she watched. She watched with the focused, exhausted attention of someone who no longer trusted their own life. She started noticing his hours. The way certain evenings he came home a little too loose, a little too easy, like someone who had already expelled the difficult energy of the day somewhere else. The way he left the room to take certain calls. The way the woman in the red dress appeared in the background of a photo she found, not through snooping, just by being on his phone to show him a photo of Scout, scrolling up one frame too many. Her name was Courtney. She was a nurse in the cardiology unit where Wesley worked rotations sometimes. She had a profile picture in which she was smiling in front of a lake, and she looked like someone's idea of radiant. Petra closed the photo and handed the phone back. "Cute dog photo," she said, and her voice was perfectly level. She was good at that. She had always been good at keeping her voice level when everything inside her was not level at all. She made an appointment with a lawyer in November, before she'd told Wesley anything, before she'd confronted him, before she'd done any of the things people said you were supposed to do. She sat in a low chair across from a woman named Loretta Gaines, who had the kind of brisk, steady manner that Petra found genuinely comforting, and she laid out the situation plainly. The lawyer listened. She asked about shared assets. She asked about the pregnancy. "Mine," Petra said. "Not, we haven't done a paternity test yet, obviously, but the timing is." She stopped. "Mine," she said again. Loretta Gaines wrote something down. "Have you spoken to him yet?" "No. Are you planning to?" Petra looked at her hands. "I'm going to need some things in order first." The lawyer nodded like this was a completely reasonable answer, which it was. She confronted him on a Sunday morning in December. Not explosively, she had decided against that, not out of composure but out of calculation. She had learned, in all those weeks of watching, that Wesley was good at managing emotion. He could apologize very fluently. He could look sorrowful in a way that felt real. She didn't want to give him anything to manage. She waited until he came downstairs and poured his coffee, and then she said quietly at the kitchen table, "How far along is Courtney?" He went very still. The coffee cup sat between his hands. "I've known for about 2 months," Petra said. "I wanted you to know that, so we can skip the part where you decide how much to tell me." He set the cup down. What followed was not a scene. It was a conversation, measured and terrible, and it lasted almost 2 hours. She learned that it had started about 8 months earlier. She learned that it hadn't been planned. She learned that Courtney was keeping the baby. She learned that Wesley had not ended it. She learned that part near the end, when he said something about needing time to figure out what he owed to different people. And she understood from the language what he owed, that he was still in the middle of something, still standing at that bar with his hand on someone else's back. She stood up from the table. "I want you out by the end of next week," she said. Petra, Scout stays. He left her 9 voicemails in the first 2 days. She listened to all of them. She didn't return any of them. January was the worst month. She was 4 months pregnant and alone in a house that still smelled like him. And she was working 35 hours a week because she needed the routine more than the rest. And she was calling Loretta Gaines every other week and trying to remember to eat dinner, even when nothing sounded good. Her mother finally came up from Colombia. She didn't say "I told you so," not once, not a single time, and Petra loved her for that more than she could say. Her mother just came and stayed for 2 weeks and made big pots of soup and sat with Petra in the evenings and let the quiet be quiet. "You're going to be okay," her mother said one night, not in a cheerful way, but in the way you say a true thing. "I know," Petra said. And she did know it. It just didn't make the knowing any easier to live inside. There was a man at her office. Not a coworker. The building where her rehabilitation center was located also housed a physical therapy practice down the hall. And the physical therapist who ran it was named Gabe. She had known him for almost 3 years in the way you know someone you see regularly in a hallway. First names, small talk, occasionally splitting a pot of coffee when the machine in her break room was broken, and he told her she could use theirs. She had not thought about Gabe in any particular way before January, but in January, when she came back from her 2 weeks of partial leave and walked in looking, she was certain, like someone who had been dragged sideways through her own life, Gabe was the one who looked up from the front desk when she passed and said, "Hey, you doing okay?" Not in a perfunctory way, in a way that meant, "I'm asking because I actually want to know." "Not especially," she said. "Okay," he said, "you don't have to be." She stood in the hallway for a second. "I make pretty good coffee," he said, "if you want some." She went and got coffee. She didn't tell him anything. They just talked about work, about a patient they'd once shared between their practices, a teenager who'd been in a car accident and recovered more fully than anyone predicted. It was a completely ordinary conversation, and it was the first time all month that she had felt like a person rather than a wound. She ran into Courtney in March. She had not planned for it. She had not prepared for it in any of the ways you try to prepare for unlikely things. It happened at a grocery store on a Saturday morning, and Courtney was coming around the corner of the produce section with a handbasket, and they nearly walked into each other, and then they were just standing there, 2 feet apart, in front of a display of oranges. Courtney looked like she was close to her due date. Petra was visibly pregnant too now, 22 weeks. The two of them stood there in the produce section for what was probably 6 seconds but felt much longer. "I'm sorry," Courtney said. Her voice was quiet. "I know that doesn't fix anything." Petra looked at her for a moment. "No," she said, "it doesn't." She put a bag of oranges in her cart and walked away. She cried in the car, briefly and thoroughly, and then she blew her nose and drove home, and unloaded the groceries and took Scout for a walk, and came back and sat on the front porch in the mild March air, and thought about all the things she was building now, slowly, out of the wreckage of what she'd thought she had. It was a different kind of building than before. Less certain, less confident, but it was hers. Gabe asked her to dinner in April. He did it with characteristic directness. She was coming out of her office at the end of the day, and he was locking up his practice door and he just said, "Petra, do you want to have dinner sometime? As friends, or whatever you're comfortable with. No pressure on the definition." She looked at him. Gabe was 40 years old. He had steady hands, which made sense for what he did, and a habit of actually finishing his sentences, which she had come to appreciate more than she expected. He was not especially tall. His hair was going a little gray at the temples, He had a daughter from a previous relationship, 7 years old, named Bex, and he talked about her the way people talk about things they are quietly, genuinely proud of. He was not what she would have designed, a year ago, if someone had asked her to describe the next chapter of her life. But the thing about the next chapter, she was learning, was that it had nothing to do with the chapter you'd written for yourself. "I'm having someone's baby," she said. "My ex-husband's. I'm 26 weeks pregnant. That's where I am." "I know," Gabe said. "I'm asking anyway." She was quiet for a moment. "Dinner," she said. "Let's call it dinner and see what happens." What happened was slow and careful and right. He didn't rush her. He didn't try to define things before she was ready to have them defined. He showed up. To dinner, to occasional walks on the greenway. To the Saturday afternoon, she texted him at the last minute, because the crib she'd ordered had arrived in 17 pieces, and she had no idea how to read the instructions, and she was sitting on the nursery floor feeling completely overwhelmed. He showed up with his toolbox and a bag of food from the Thai place she liked, and they put the crib together over the course of 3 hours while Bex, who had come with him, solemnly organized the hardware by size. "She does this at home too," Gabe said, watching his daughter arrange tiny screws into perfect rows. "I like systems," Bex said without looking up. Petra laughed, really laughed, for the first time since she couldn't remember when. The baby came in July, a girl. Petra named her Sloane, after her grandmother on her mother's side, who had been the most self-possessed woman Petra had ever known. Her mother drove up from Colombia and was in the delivery room, and Gabe was in the waiting room, which was exactly where she'd asked him to be. Close enough that she'd know he was there. Far enough that she didn't have to manage anyone else's experience while she was going through her own. When it was over, and she was lying in the hospital bed with Sloane on her chest, small and astonishing and real, she thought of all the mornings she'd spent staring at herself in the bathroom mirror, trying to understand what she was feeling. All those Tuesdays watching the little dots appear and disappear, all the nights on the bathroom floor. The nurse came to check vitals, and outside in the hallway Petra could hear her mother's voice and Gabe's voice, speaking quietly, and the sound of them, just the quiet ordinariness of two people who loved her waiting for her, was the best thing she'd heard in a year. Wesley sent flowers to the hospital. Petra left them at the nurse's station. The divorce was finalized in September. There were no surprises. Loretta Gaines had been thorough. Courtney had a boy. Petra knew this not because she sought out the information, but because it appeared in a corner of the internet. She stumbled into once, and then navigated away from. She didn't carry it. It was not her weight to carry. What she carried instead was Sloane, who at 3 months had opinions about everything, about the angle of the light in the morning, about the specific texture of the knit blanket versus the fleece one, about whether Scout was lying close enough. Sloane was, as it turned out, a great deal like her mother, specific, determined, not easily settled for less than what she wanted. Gabe was good with her, patient with her nonsense, genuinely delighted by her, the way people are delighted by small beings who don't yet know they need to be charming. One evening in November, he was sitting on the front porch couch. They had finally gotten furniture for the porch, with Sloane asleep on his chest and Scout curled at his feet. And Petra came out with 2 mugs of tea and sat down beside him, and he carefully transferred Sloane to the crook of his arm without waking her. "You know," he said quietly, "you're the most capable person I've ever met." She wrapped her hands around her mug. The evening was cool and smelled like dry leaves. "I don't feel capable," she said. "You built all of this," he said, "while everything else was falling apart. You didn't stop. That's all capability is." She thought about that for a while. She thought about the bathroom counter with 3 pregnancy tests lined up in a row. She thought about the parking garage, about the produce section, about Loretta Gaines saying, "Have you spoken to him yet?" in her quiet, brisk way, about Sloane's heartbeat on the ultrasound screen while she cried in a dim room, alone, not knowing what came next. She hadn't stopped. She just hadn't known at the time that that was the thing she was doing. "I need to tell you something," she said. Gabe looked at her. "I'm in love with you," she said. "I've been trying to figure out when to say it, and I've decided the answer is just now. While Sloane is asleep and the dog is here and the tea is warm. Now is when I want to say it." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I've been in love with you since you said not especially in the hallway in January and didn't pretend otherwise." Sloane stirred between them and then settled again, and the street was quiet, and the leaves on the old oak at the edge of the yard turned in a small breeze, and Petra let herself sit inside that moment without trying to hold it too tightly or name it too precisely or prepare for it to end. She had learned this year that some things did not need to be prepared for. Some things you could just let come towards you and trust yourself to meet them. That was enough. She was finding more than enough.